Welcome to the last webinar of the 10 Myths Against Pornography campaign. Our campaign is coming to an end this week, and we're really happy to have Linda MacDonald and Jeanne Sarson with us today. They are from Persons Against Non-State Torture, which is an organization, a self-funded organization of researchers, scholars, and human rights educators, but also just grassroots organizers that fight against non-state torture, and also fight for the recognition of non-state torture as a human rights crime. But I don't want to take any more time of them because I think they're both really amazing women, so I would rather them introduce themselves. So yeah, Linda and Jeanne, the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you, Adriana. I'm Linda, and this is Jeanne, and sorry for us being late. We got the times mixed up. Not very good Canadians to get our times mixed up. Anyways, we're both retired nurses, and we started in 1993 with a one-night-a-week private nursing practice, helping men or women who had endured some form of violence in their life. And 6 months into it, a woman came to us that had started describing ordeals of torture, some of them torture pornography. And from that, we developed into a campaign. Really, there's just the two of us, Jeanne and I. We're nonprofit, or not even nonprofit. We're self-funded. And we've been advocating for almost over 27 years now to have non-state torture recognized as a human rights violation and a crime, and have included much about human trafficking and pornography and prostitution and families who torture their children in our work. So we'll start with the first slide. And that's pretty well us saying that we're trying to unsilence women. So our hopes by sharing these 25 years of our work, 27, sorry, model making, is that we'll name torture of girls and women inflicted by private individuals and groups in a framework for other feminists. That's the hope of us speaking today. And this model promotes safety, respect, and dignity for women and girls who have survived, to be understood and not to be called crazy, disbelieved, or treated as mentally ill. That's one of the huge aspects of non-state torture, is women are pathologized. And women and girls are pathologized to be seen as mentally ill, and that's a grave violation of their human rights. And never to be forgotten, Article number 5, that no one shall be subjected to torture, and other forms of exploitation and pornography and prostitution are also human rights. So we base all our work as a human rights framework, and women find this very liberating. And you'll see in 1948 it was started by Eleanor Roosevelt, a woman, and many other women from around the world. We had to fight to get our name as women in the document of human rights, UN Declaration. Okay, Adriana. So we do a participatory questionnaire with women who contact us on our webpage, asking them if they will tell us what they think the difference between torture and assault is, to help people clarify whether they have been tortured, and to help us clarify what people think about the distinguishing factors between torture and assault, and to see it as a different crime than assault and abuse. Because in our country and in many countries, the torture of women and girls is still described as an assault. So many of the indicators or rationale that women say that separate torture from assault is that torture is dehumanization. It's the severity of the mental and physical pain and suffering, and horror and terror, the intensity of it, and an overwhelming sense of humiliation and anguish. And with torture, there is a destruction of the sense of self that's very intentional, whereas with abuse or assault, it's control of the woman and girl. And with that destruction of the sense of self comes, of course, the destruction that women and girls know that they are human. Many of the women that come to us really don't understand that they're human until we start having conversations with them. Next slide. So here is one of the models that we have, and we have assault on the left-hand side and torture on the right-hand side. And assault is the power and control wheel from Duluth, and if you look at the distinguishing behaviors or actions in assault. There's coercion and threats, intimidation, emotional abuse, economic abuse, male privilege, using children, minimizing, denying and blaming, and physical and sexualized assaults. And on the torture side, the distinguishing factors are different. There's a huge amount of electric shocking that occurs with survivors of non-state torture. Physical tortures listed such as beatings, burnings, whipping, cutting. And then the immobilization torture, such as being tied up, hung. They're often put in cages or confined. And then the water torture, which we hear in the traditional or state torture, which is pouring water or immersing someone in water to feel that they're going to go to a near-drowning experience. And women and girls are forced in bathtubs and toilets and sinks, anywhere where there's water in the everyday sense, rivers, lakes, oceans. Suffocating, choking and strangulation, which is seen a lot in pornography. Sexualized torture, of course, which we see in pornography, raping, rape with objects, bestiality, pornography, and snuff film use. And the chemical torturing, which is the drugging. A huge amount of drugging to silence the women and girls, to confuse them, and to gain more pleasure, because the perpetrators, if the women or girls are drugged, they can torture them more. Pleasure for the perpetrators, of course. Deprivation of all kinds of sustenance of life, such as water and food, sleep, and bathroom use, exposing to extremes of heat and cold and light and dark. You often hear of a woman held in a windowless room with or one light in the room, and it's never turned off, so that they don't have any sense of day or night. Psychological torturing, humiliation and dehumanization, which the women talk about, the forced nakedness, forced witnessing the others of torture and pets, and women tell us that is often the worst, because they care for other women and other children, and they can't do anything about it. They have to hear their torture screams. That sense of extreme powerlessness when you're inflicted with torture pain, and also the ritualism tactics that sometimes the torturers use, pseudo-drama, to heighten the pleasure of the perpetrator again. So you can see there's a difference in the two columns between the assault and the torture, and that's how we distinguish what torture is versus assault. Okay, Adriana, thank you. And this is the questionnaire that we have on our website. It has 49 different questions of the different harms that women have endured, and they tick the boxes off to say what has happened to them, and it pretty well follows the model that we talked about before. And sadly, some women can tick off every one of those. We've had women tick off every one of those, and you'll see the pornography pictures there, and the snuff films is included in our questionnaire. Some women don't tick off as many. It varies from individual what type of torture that they endure. But people have to understand that these brutal acts of torture are often happening simultaneously, even just in one day. A woman can endure all of those things in one day. Okay, Adriana. So the questionnaire has around the harms inflicted, the N, or the amount of respondents were 80. 49% identified electric shocking, so you can see how common the electric shocking is. And the pornography pictures taken was 67%. So that really shows how common torture is in pornography, sadly. And snuff images, for anyone who doesn't know, is the filming of a real-life murder or femicide. So it could be torture femicide. 41% have been involved in seeing those images taken when they were present. And treated as a non-human. 99% said they were treated as a non-human. And that's the dehumanization of non-state torture that so many women describe as so brutal to their sense of self. And these are the drawings that we have, we share with you from women who've come to us for support. And these are the reasons why we can't, some of the women are going to be writing their own stories, and some just want their drawings private, so these we won't be able to share in the future, but we're showing them to you today. So this is a woman who came to us from the UK, and she described being involved in child pornography, and you can see her there in a cage, and you can see in the top left this adult taking a photo, the film of her, and all the other pictures below show the extensiveness of her getting out of the cage, and all the adults around there, and there's a whip and the torture involved in the pornography. And she described this as a torture party. The perpetrators code their language and call the torture that they're doing as a party. So then if children tell that they've been to a party, adults don't think that there's anything wrong with it, or they'll start to disbelieve the children. If they describe what happened at the party, they'll think the children, it's a way to keep the children seen as mentally ill or not believable in some way, to code the language. So there's trafficking involved, and there's crime scene pornography and the victimization of this little girl child. Next slide. And this is another one of her when she was a little girl. Those are real pictures of her when she was tiny with her little teddy bear. At the same time, her mother was taking her to a so-called modeling agency. And actually what was happening, it was trafficking for pornography. And you can see by the drawings that she thought she was going to a modeling school. But then she talks about, I don't want to, I look down, flash, whir, click, flash, whir, click. I'm 2 years and 4 months old. So as tiny as 2 years and 4 months old, she was forced into torture, pornography, and trafficking by her mother. And it took her a long time to bring clarity to that, but the drawings were important for her to understand, and to understand the violation of trust and the betrayal that she endured with such atrocity. Next slide. So now we have another drawing of a different woman, and she was from the same again as a little girl. It was homemade pornography. Her parents made the pornography, and you can see there's a man holding the camera there. And the little girl feels dark and cold and naked, and they're playing a song, Tie a Yellow Ribbon Around the Old Oak Tree. That was the music conditioning that was used when she was trafficked and transported for the pornography. Whoops. And she was also, one of the things that it took a little while for us to figure out, but adults showed the pornography to children as an educational tool. I put educational quotations, educating them how to learn to do good or to be conditioned into torture so that their family will love me. That's the language that was used to trick the children, this little girl and her other children, into believing that pornography and torture was a kind of love. And I mean, it just shows the atrocity of the violations that young children are forced into. So she was trafficked in her home and transported elsewhere for this pornography. Jean's going to finish the next ones.
No, I'm okay.
Right.
I just want to say the reason we share, we've been doing this, like Linda said, for 27 years. And we do know the more we can talk, we do know the women that we support, the more they can speak their truth, it helps to heal. So often people ask us how we've managed for 27 years, and this is one way that we manage, is we share the time. Anytime we can talk, we share the time. So going on with where Linda left off, this is Sophie. She is the youngest youth that came to us. She was 17. She's from the U.S. And she talked about being trafficked into Prague from New York City and witnessing a snuff film. And that's her drawing. We found often women can't tell us in words, they often have to draw. So her drawing was that's her going up the stairs. That you see the stairs on one side. And the drawing is about another young girl who the perpetrator has a knife to her throat, and she becomes a witness. So the positive there, we have her supporter on the 9th of November 2014. A surprise to us, her supporter emailed us that she is happy, enthusiastic participant in life now. She told me the other day that she hasn't considered killing herself for a long time because suicide is the need or the feeling or the want sometimes to commit suicide because the suffering is so horrific. It can be a minute-by-minute intervention that you have to do, and women have to be free to talk about their suicidality feelings all the time. Some weeks it's every day. So it's just to know that that's can be a normal response that has to be talked about. So anyway, she's graduating with a master's degree in nursing, and like I said, your kindness and support surely helped. And what's so important there is that with the right care and the right support, women can heal and move into their life. And the next one, please, the next slide. And this is Sophie again. The way she could talk about the snuff, she wrote a lot of poems, and this one is an example from one of her poems. It says, "Do you remember? I don't." That was one way to protect herself psychologically, to say, I don't remember, yet she knew she did. And this is what she wrote. "Do you remember the camera surrounding the bed? Do you remember him saying to you, 'These whips are standard, marks are gone after a few hours'?" We hear that quite often, actually, that comment. "Do you remember him telling me the movies like this one is that I'm going to be and make a lot of money?" So then she says, "I don't." "Do you remember seeing another girl on the bed, being held by her ponytail, knife at her throat? Do you remember how she fought to stay so hard to live?" And then she says, "I don't." "Do you remember all the blood? Do you remember him wiping the blood on me? I don't." So that was the horror that she had to express in poem as well as the drawing. So for anyone who's working, and I know the Radical Girls on some of the webinars you've given, you've talked about torture. So it may come to women in different ways. What's really important is they say they've been tortured, to absolutely say back to them, "I hear that you're telling me you were tortured." Because women tell us all the time that often they'll say they're tortured and somebody will go back and say, "Oh, so you were abused." And they find that very insulting and a disrespect to them. So I'll go to the next slide, please. So what happens for the women that have come to us, the ones who have been harmed from early childhood, if they don't have truthful language like we're sharing with you today, they don't understand that what they're enduring is exploitation because they've normalized what's happened to them as a way of surviving. So if, as an adult, that's their norm. So this is an example of an adult woman who was trafficked and tortured and pornographically victimized as a child. And her father and mother were her perpetrators, and they had connection to others. So she didn't know that that was not an everyday reality for everyone. So her father would call her up, even though she was outside of the home and an adult. He would call her up and tell her to go somewhere, and she would disassociate and appear to go to the perp who wanted to torture and pornographically victimize her again. So it's really important that we understand their right to speak the language that they need to express themselves, and we have to be able to follow their path so that they learn that they're being victimized. So the next one, please. So this is an example of Elizabeth. She was born into a family that tortured and trafficked and pornographically victimized her. And without the language, each episode of being victimized is like in a black box, she says. And she's carrying all those around. If you can't open the box and talk about them and know that other people can listen and be supportive. So she drew this to express the weight of silence. So for Linda and I, we're trying to unsilence the whole issue that women and girls suffer torture, torture pornography, torture and prostitution, and torture in everyday life. So this was her example to share. Okay, the next one, please. So this is a little bit of what I expressed earlier. If we don't talk truthfully using the terminology that is respectful to them, then it dismisses them. So she says, I do speak about torture. Sometimes I feel so isolated, like being in a place and no one talks my language, which is true. If we don't talk the language, then we're not listening and we're not hearing. And I have to keep relating to their language, even though it is not my language. It is a social isolation, difficult to describe. So that's where the stigmatization comes in, and the exclusion, feeling you're not part of society. And then women they go to meetings that talk about violence against women. And if torture is not brought up, what we hear is that, well, they talked about many forms of violence, but they didn't bring up torture. So that's the isolation if we don't use the words that respects and gives them dignity for what they have survived. Okay, so this is two drawings from two different women. Both were Canadian. One left Canada to flee for safety. And this is about understanding post-traumatic stress responses. We do not call it post-traumatic stress disorder because we think that's unfair to women to tell them they have a disorder. I don't know what any of us would think if we survive torture. Do you think we'll be out there smiling and happy, you know, that you can survive this and somehow in the end being told you are disordered instead of knowing that you've had responses to survive. And one of the responses for surviving is disassociation. So Sarah, there you can see for her, she separated every part of her body, like her head is not connected to her neck is not connected to her torso, her arms and hands are disconnected, and her legs and her feet. And often when we first met her in 1993, when she talked about the head, the hand. So it was, her language was telling us that she had disassociated survival responses. And survival responses can occur spontaneously. And they're very different than the inflicted disassociation that torturers look for pedophiles look for pornographers look for. They watch for, often the eyes will show disassociation in one way or another, either rolling back into their head is one way that might show up. So perpetrators inflict a degree of pain for that purpose. It's a pleasure for them. And we had a woman whose husband tortured her, and she told us that he used to say, "Keep your eyes open, bitch. I'd like to see the terror in your eyes." So there's a thrill there for them. So we have to separate the two. so that women understand themselves. And the other drawing by Alex, that's her effort trying to put herself back together again. Like Linda said, the dehumanization, their failure to not understand they're a human being. Most of the women tell us they didn't know they were human or they had human rights. That's why it's really important about the human rights. Okay, I'll go to the next one.
Keep clicking.
Yeah, I think you have to click
keep
again.
Clicking, Adriana, because of there.
Okay. Oops.
There. Thank you.
So this one is our victimization, traumatization, informed care. We have to go back to 1993 when the first woman came to us. There was no recognition at the UN level, in Canada, or anywhere that we could find that the torture of women by private individuals or non-state actors was even recognized. And there was no really word for non-state actors until Amnesty International put out a pamphlet in 2000, and they talked about non-state actors. So we took the non-state actors and say, okay, non-state torture, which is torture perpetrated by private individuals, pornographers, traffickers, a spouse, whoever. So what we learned, often we hear trauma-informed care, but what we've learned is that for example, I can give you a concrete example. About a month ago, we did a webinar with women who, and a few men who were harmed by clergy. And one woman said, I've never been told I was victimized. She said, for 30 years, I've been going to therapy, and nobody ever told me I was victimized. They just said, look at the trauma, forget the victimization. She said, I never knew that before. And we hear that a lot from women. I didn't know what was happening to me was a crime. So it makes a difference in helping them understand that it's not their fault, they were not to blame, that when somebody victimizes another human being, it's the person who's doing the victimization that's held to account. So what we did there, we separate the acts of torture, and like Linda said, a woman could fill in them all, some will fill in half, and just last night I was looking at 11 new questionnaires that Linda hadn't figured out, we hadn't figured out in the data she gave you, and out of the 11, 4 talked about snuff again. So either used or made. And at one time people didn't believe snuff films or videos happened, but I think it was 2000 when the police in the UK arrested a UK man for the snuff film that he had bought from Russian mob. In the Russian mob, the guy who tortured and killed the person, the man in the UK was negotiating with him to do it again in a way that this man wanted the killing done of a young person. So it's really important for us to know what women could be subjected to and what they're being subjected to. Now, the other thing on the non-state torture questionnaires also, we wanted to bring up the choking. So I looked at the 11 new ones last night, and out of the 11 new questionnaires, 11 of the women said they were choked. So that's 100%. And 9 said they were suffocated. So choke and strangulation often goes hand in hand depending on how a person is choked. Our questionnaire, Nels women describe more. We don't have details except that they say that they were choked. And then I looked at the 80 that Linda talked about earlier, and out of the 80, 75 out of the 80 were choked, and 39 out of the 80 were suffocated. So it's really critical that women know the dangers of choking and strangulation, because a person can die very quickly, or they can die days or weeks later if there's damage to the carotid artery in their neck. If that artery gets damaged, it could formulate a clot, and the clot can travel to the brain. So it's critical that women understand the dangers that's presented to them. And the other thing that we know, if it's serial strangulation, the risk, if the perpetrator is doing this repeatedly, the risk goes up 750%. So
for femicide.
For femicide, yeah. That repeated strangulation, that is the risk. So it's really important. And we know women have died, so-called rough sex, women have died. And in the UK, their perpetrators are trying to use the rough sex excuse that it was consensual, but you can't consent to torture. So it's really important that women have a clear boundary about what they're being placed at risk for. So the traumatization, the other part of, if we're listening to women, the trauma that their post-traumatic stress responses is to know already, like we showed, the conditioned dissociative response. And the flashbacks they'll have, the vicarious trauma. Now, often the vicarious trauma, what we hear is that the vicarious trauma is related to the person listening, to the severity of the harm that's being inflicted, or the torture that's being inflicted. But what we've learned is that disassociation is a way of staying safe and surviving. So once the disassociation starts healing, they start understanding that, say, if they're disassociated up on the ceiling, looking down at the person being tortured, the disassociation creates a distance, that's not them down there. But as they heal, they start understanding that that's them down there that's being tortured, that she's being tortured. So that brings the vicarious trauma for them as they integrate the reality that they survived. So it's important to be able to explain that to them when they go into grief. Cultural and worldview adjustments. If you've lived a life that has been so harmful to you, survival becomes so necessary that you miss a lot of other realities around you. So there's a big adjustment if you happen to have years of pornographic torture, victimization, and trafficking damage. Consequence harms to one's relationship with themselves. Linda already mentioned that they will not know they're a person. And actually, we've asked women, how am I doing for time? Oh, okay. We've asked women to draw a picture of themselves, and sometimes they have no sense at all of a physicality. They may not even know they have skin. And actually, we had a woman in her 70s who said it was amazing for her to learn that she had skin, and younger women too. So that's the degree, is to respect that that's survival. It's an amazing process how the mind has kept women and young girls alive through the torture and the torture pornography and the torture trafficking and prostituted victimizations. So if you don't even know you have a relationship with yourself as a human being, then of course It's to rebuild your confidence and your esteem, to build trust in the people who you're trusting to tell your story to, that they'll be safe. And tragically, a lot of professionals haven't been safe. Women have been harmed by professionals that were supposed to care for them, and they've been tortured and trafficked by professionals who were supposed to care for them. And that idea that they're a thing, they're an object, an it, or a robot. The other consequence, they've been told repeatedly that it's their fault, that they're to blame, so they can internalize self-blame, self-hatred, and body hatred, especially for their vagina, for their breasts. So you get into the self-cutting and the suicidality. And the emotional confusion with disassociation, we have to, for surviving, we listen as they are confused by having emotion, because disassociation cuts down the emotion in order to help them survive. So when they start having emotional feelings, it's terrifying. It can be. What is this feeling I'm having? I'm not used to it. It's terrifying. So it's a lot of emotional work that it's important that they understand is normal, or it's not going to hurt them. And I've talked about their sense of having no sense of a physical body or skin, how they fit in the world. If they've had years of victimization, it's a big adjustment, especially when the world excludes them from so much, doesn't listen to them, doesn't respect, like Elizabeth said, the language that they have to speak in order to understand themselves and to have the world understand them. And it's very hard work and fatigue and sleep sessions. Linda and I, the first woman that came to us, she was a single woman. She had a master's degree. She was highly educated, but she did not know that she lived two lives. She had a professional life, and she had a victimization life of torture and trafficking and pornographic victimizations. And often for her to heal, we would let her sleep. We would stay in the room where she knew she was safe, and we'd let her sleep for an hour and a half, because we know for the brain to heal, people need sleep. And she couldn't sleep because in her own apartment, because she never knew when any of the perpetrators would show up, because of course she did not know that she could say no, and she did not know that she didn't have to open the door to anybody who knocked on her door, because that was her norm. So to help create safety, it goes to be that basic. Who do you open the door to? Who do you never open the door to? Who do you answer the telephone to? Who you don't answer the telephone to? Very basic interventions that are everyday way of functioning that's safe. Okay, the next one, please. So, as I said earlier, in 1993, Linda and I had no experience around how to help a woman, cope and survive and heal from torture victimization that included trafficking, that included pornographic victimizations, and prostituted victimizations that had gone on almost 30 years. She was almost 30 years old when we met her. So with no literature anywhere that we could find, we had to tell her that we couldn't find any support for her, and yet we didn't want to abandon her because she was severely traumatized. She was just hanging on. And when she called us originally, she said she was going to commit suicide in 4 days. We had never met her. In the end, we stayed with her, and she's alive today, and she got out of the victimization, organized crime and family that she had been born into. So when we looked at the fact that the torture of women in the everyday reality was not even a thought in this global reality of all forms of violence against women and girls, we decided to try to make a model. And we got these three categories. The non-state torture that happens like in families with a partner or like-minded others. But then the second category, which is what we're really talking about, the commercial-based, that they're trafficked and tortured. Usually somebody's making money, somebody is having a benefit in some way. Some of the women knew that their parents or their spouse was making money on them when they trafficked and tortured them. Same with when they prostituted them. And the torture porn, as we know, they're worth a whole lot of money, supposedly. The snuff films and photographs, some of that, it seems, is just getting to be so-called the normal pornography these days. But really, for Linda and I, we just make a firm stand that torture pornography is torture, and we cannot excuse it as sexualized pornography, entertainment. It's it's not something to think that our children have to grow up with, that young women have to be subjected to, young men think that that's norm. So we put the migrant domestic workers, because here again that's commercial based, and there is a literature in the EU around how domestic workers have been tortured and maybe not paid for the work that they've done, and just kept imprisoned more or less with no time off, working 24/7. So we put those two categories. Now the third category, we know social cultural traditions. It's here again to respect all women and girls, like the FGM, the female genital mutilation. We know our millions of young, very young children and older children. The acid burning, the widow burning, and like Linda was mentioning earlier, the stoning of women would be torture. There's violence committed against women that has been so normalized that as women we're failing to understand the brutality sometimes. So for Linda and I, it's like enough is enough. We have to stand and know that women and girls are being tortured in many ways across this planet. So we've created those three categories, and category 3 would be evolving. Okay, the next one. Okay, this is a wheel, a non-state torture wheel and fact sheet. If you go on our website, the fact sheet is with it. This is just a wheel, and I know it's hard to read, but we created that with the London Abused Women's Centre in London, Ontario, Canada, because we did a workshop with them in 2015, and they introduced non-state torture into their intake form. And they're getting about 60 women a year who definitely identify as having suffered torture. And often it is with a husband or a male that they have a relationship with, according to their data. Now, how this has been used, women tell us that what they've done, they use the wheel and they go around it, and it helps them identify the types of victimizations they've suffered. And if it's been organized, they start to understand that say for the woman, Lynn is her name, the woman that told Linda and I her story about her husband grooming her for 6 months, marrying her, and all the time he had connection with 3 other men in a different part of Canada, that he took her there, and what they did, they isolated her in a room, chained her to a radiator, handcuffed her there, and kept her there except when she was being trafficked and tortured and prostituted. There was one dirty mattress in the room. And so that's the organized and the network. Her spouse had a network that she knew nothing about. And for some people, in her case, they were organized crime. But some people that we know, they're politicians, they're professionals, non-professionals, so they can have police, yeah, judges, lawyers, nurses, doctors, I don't know, farmers, fishers. So they can live in the community and look very respectful. And because we've been at it so long, we've watched some of their obituaries, and their obituaries keep saying, oh, he was loved by the whole community. So we know that's not true. But they use the cover of respectability because they're hoping that women stay naive and silenced enough that we don't speak out about the harms that are occurring. So if anyone is interested, you can go on our website and just download this. This is fine. And the last slide, here again, that's just to remind people around the Me Too that non-state torture and exploitations around trafficking, prostitution, and pornographic victimizations occur, and torture is happening. And for Linda and I, and for the women that have trusted us with their stories, we cannot be silent. And this is a postcard here again. This is on our website. And it's just to remember that there's pictures of houses there. It can happen in houses, it can happen in apartments, it can happen in motels. There's no place that really can be safe from victimization. So it's important to know that we should be all free to say Me Too. So that's the end of the slides. I know it's a whole lot maybe in a short time, but we're open to any questions that you might have or anything we can clarify.
Thank you so much. If anybody has a question, please write it down, and we will address it to Linda and Jeanne. But we already have the first question, which is, where can we find your research and articles?
Yeah, so our website is www.nonstatetorture.org. And we have a whole list of reference articles on our website, but we can send you a document with them all on the updated ones, Adrienne, that you can share with everyone.
Okay, great. A woman sent me. There was a question. There was someone who seemed to think that the definition of snuff films was only pornographic movies. So they want kind of a definition of it, if it's possible.
Well, it's the murder. It's the filming of the murder of a woman.
Okay.
Or a girl. Or a girl.
Yeah. It can be a child.
It could be a child, yeah.
But that's what a snuff. It's like snuff is to snuff out your breath. You know, it's like you're taking your last breath on video. It's the murder.
Yeah,
the real life murder. Femicide is more like it, really, when it's women and girls. It's a femicide.
Okay.
It's a torture femicide video, really, filming.
Thank you. There's another question: is how can you identify what leads women that are tortured in the sex trade to reach out and start their healing process? Like, what does it take for these women that are tortured to reach out and really get out of this torture that is inflicted upon them?
You mean in prostitution?
Yeah, it was more like the women that are tortured in the sex trade.
Yeah, in the sex trade. Well, for me, it's like the PowerPoint slide where Elizabeth says, if you don't talk my language, I think that's why if we have a continuum of violence against women and girls, we have to put torture on that continuum so that they know that if they speak out, there's somebody there who acknowledges that torture happens, that knows that they can tell their whole story, and that is acceptable, it's welcomed, and it's heard, and just to know that they have the right to speak their truth, and they have the right and the expectation to be listened to. So that's what, for me, Elizabeth's drawing represents, the ability to tell your truth.
Women will often tell us that when they contact us, they'll say, we know you understand. We know that you've heard all these stories, so we don't have to hold back with you. We can tell you everything, the worst things that have ever happened to us, because we know that you're not going to judge us or think that we're crazy or not believe us. That's very common for women to tell us that. And they just start right in with the worst things that have ever happened to them. It's like they were waiting for someone to tell. Because you know you can't heal unless you've told everything that's happened to you. So you have to know the worst to become the best of yourself. So we tell them never to hold back, and nothing will ever, we listen together, so they know that we're taking care of each other and that we're speaking about it and that we can cope with the reality of it. So it's important for them. I think women knowing that they can speak their truth, it helps them exit.
Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering, how do you women cope with the reality? Because I imagine that in the beginning it must have been very, very hard to listen to all this and just continue your work. I'm really wondering how you maintain your mental, in a way.
Well, I talked a lot. I talked a lot about my feelings, about how I felt about hearing such atrocity. The anger I had, I had a little bit of fear, but not very much. But the fear I had, mostly the anger, and I talked about reframing my worldview. I had to reframe my worldview and understand that I thought that this was a rare occurrence. But as we know, in pornography, apparently gonzo porn, or what Gail Dines talks about, that's pretty well the routine now. So I think we have to understand that our propensity for humans, especially male humans, is to enjoy the atrocious suffering of women is pretty common, much more common than I understood in '93. So I had to reshape my worldview and take time with myself with that, and give myself patience with it, and write about it, do things that I enjoy to heal, to keep beauty in my life, to remind myself that the world isn't all dark, that there are good people, and that we're going to get better as a society when I think I just saw it was my responsibility, and it was also a privilege to be able to hear these stories, to see it in that light, to see it as positive, to be able to support women so that they could live a good life and contribute to society, that we could understand that this is part of our human behavior.
I think for me, I really didn't have fear. I mean, I was born into a family that my father was very violent, so I learned manipulation very, very young, probably about three and a half. So I didn't have fear, but I think what was essential was the hard work. I mean, it was hard. There's no question about it, because we had no support, because nobody was talking about it, and everybody, when we tried to talk about it, people told us we were crazy. So we kind of went underground, to be truthful. You know, we kind of stopped talking except to each other to try to make sense. And what helped me was making the models that we've shared. You know, we had to make sense of what we were hearing because there was nothing else that we could rely on except our own brain power and our own caring to try to understand what this first woman was trying to tell us, because she didn't understand either. She was just so traumatized. She was just flowing trauma and victimization all over the place. So we had to make sense of that. And then, so we made the model so we could kind of organize our thinking and our caring and understanding her. But then we thought, well, this was one woman. Are there other women in Nova Scotia? We're a small province, and we just kind of put out word of mouth. And 5 years later, we did a research project, and 5 other women came, and they told us the same story. So then we showed them the model, and they said, yeah, it's just wonderful that you've got this organized, because it was so, the victimization is so huge that they couldn't organize it themselves. So for me, that was healing, in order to understand, because then when you understand something, and even for them, you get a sense of security. That's your self-esteem and your confidence, that when you say, I was tortured, you don't have to worry if everybody's going to look at you and say, that doesn't make sense. When you have a model and say, yes, people are telling us this, these are the questionnaires, and people are saying this. So that has been very helpful. And every time a woman heals and we see them living their lives freely, I don't think there's the value was so high. It's like Sophie, the PowerPoint there, she was 17 and now she's living and graduating from nursing. Those are
immeasurable.
Immeasurable, yeah. I get emotional just thinking about it, because how can it be, even in 1993, that we could live and walk in a room with other women, and yet knowing there's women in that room who have been, who are, or at risk of being tortured. How can this be? And now we're 2020. How can it be that this is what we're having to say? Enough is enough,
Driving force for me is I'm very determined, because I know some of the perpetrators, alleged perpetrators in this area. They've never been taken to court because the women are too terrified. And I know that I have little grandchildren living in this world, little girls, and I am not going to let those perpetrators win. It's not going to happen. They can't get away with this forever. So if enough of us get angry enough and determined enough, eventually they will be exposed, just like Weinstein or Epstein or any of those other organized crime traffickers, pornographers, or whatever they are. They're not indefeatable. And I'm just very, very determined.
Thank you so much. I'm having a hard time even just maintaining a straight face. There's a question that is, do you work with women who are being tortured concurrent to their therapy, or have they all escaped it materially before they come to you?
The first woman we worked totally with, she was going to a therapist, a female therapist, but we learned over time that the female therapist was part of a small group of women who were also torturing and trafficking her. So we worked with her solely, but other women, we work with their counselors. They have counselors, and I can give you some examples. One woman, she had a baby, unregistered baby, that was born. Her uncle had her in the country, and she had the baby there. She was just a teenager. And they made baby pornographic victimizations, and eventually they murdered her, so that would have been a snuff film when she was about 18 months, a little baby. So for years, the woman just couldn't bring herself to integrate that reality. So what she did with us, she negotiated with us to hear her story, because like Linda said, women came to know that we know about torture. So what she did, what we negotiated, is that whenever she felt like it, she'd send a little paragraph or 2 or 3 lines via email, a part of her story. And when she figured she had told all of her story, I took all her emails that she sent to Linda and I and wrote it into a story with interventions intertwined, explanations of what was going on. And she took that to her therapist, and they worked that through, and she integrated that. And with her therapist, they went to the police, and the police found evidence of the pornographic victimizations that her uncle had made. And so they went hunting for him, and he found that out, and he committed suicide before they got to him. But that's an example of one way that we've worked. Often women want to tell, like that, because we hear from so many women in so many different countries. You know, we started here in Nova Scotia, but we hear from the U.S., from the U.K., from Western Europe, from Israel, from the Philippines,
New Zealand.
From Australia, New Zealand, Africa. When we go to the UN, we hear, you know, there's no country on this planet that women aren't being tortured in some form.
Joining into that, somebody wants to know how do you let everyone know that you exist, and how do women learn about the work, and how can they come to you and share their story?
Well, we have our website and Facebook, and we do seminars. I see where they're asking. We had 5 planned this year, but COVID that killed all those. You know, we were going to be speaking in Sweden and Texas, and in London, Ontario, and in Boston. They were going to be doing a whole seminar on non-state torture in Boston in Cambridge, or Connecticut, sorry, University of Connecticut. So sadly, that's all been stopped now. But and we do podcasts. Word of mouth is big, though, and we have a book manuscript. If anyone knows of a publisher that would like to publish our book, we've just finished our own manuscript. So we'd be appreciative if anyone knows of a feminist publisher. That we had one in Nova Scotia, but they didn't feel. We have a book agent who said if she was still publishing, she'd love to publish our book, but this publisher in Nova Scotia didn't feel they could handle the story. It's a big story. You know, it's a big story. Non-state torture is a big story.
Our member Big Wonders is suggesting Spinifex Press.
Yeah, we did approach Spinifex Press as well, but they found that the stories were brutal to read, so I don't know. They might feel differently now. We've kind of re-edited it. Maybe we should try again. I mean, you can't hide the brutality of torture. And how are you going to teach people about what happens if they don't see it described? Otherwise, we're going to imagine something much less that women endure. And so we all deserve the truth. You know, we just have to, you know, we have to accept the reality that torture is brutal.
Yeah, because we haven't shared in many ways a lot of the examples we have, like the sexualized victimization, you know, the forced impregnations, the forced abortions, and I'm trying to remember the research numbers. but it's eluding me. But about, I want to say 120, but I don't know if that's right, but almost quite a few of those women who answered around the reproductive torture, some of them were forced to eat the tissue.
Fetal tissue.
The fetal tissue. So if they can't talk about that, that is such a horror for them. The only way you can heal is to be freed. And women have told us that that's some of the hardest conversations they have to have, because they were just told that they were evil often. So we have to understand that evil is a human action. You know, these are people who do atrocious acts for their pleasure. Their pleasure is the destruction of women and girls. And if you're feeling, like Linda said, with non-human, to me, if I'm being treated that I feel non-human, that's a warning sign. Get yourself the hell out of there, you know, because that should tell you something if you're not being looked at as an equal person, if you're feeling that this doesn't feel right. So, like we say, we try to go softly as much as we could. But I know that's one of the most horrendous suffering that women have told us about. And some women have drawn what that means, and we haven't shared that either because we were focused on the pornographic victimization and the torture. But it's about, really, we call it women unsilenced. I sometimes think that 2020 around the globe, women are saying enough is enough. We have to speak our truth and we have to be heard, and we can't keep surviving like this and thinking that we should be silent. I feel strongly about that, you know.
I feel like when women will hear your recordings, especially young women, unfortunately, they will relate in some way, but I feel like really this recording is historical because you are naming it, and it's actually the first time that I've heard women name it, even if they're in the feminist movement. It's not something that we really encounter every day. So thank you. I think it's really historical, and that it will definitely help a lot of people. And I will definitely look for publishers because I want to read that book. We have a last question. If any of the women have a question, please write it down and I will address it. This question comes from Beck again, and it's, if MindGeek has its headquarters in Canada, wouldn't it be possible for it to be held accountable under Canadian human rights frameworks or torture laws or something in the like?
We don't have a law against non-state torture in Canada. It's only state torture. That's why we've been fighting to get non-state torture in the law in Canada. That's one option. I hope that women in other countries, like in California, they have a law against torture. It's generic. It's not divided into state or non-state. Ours is specifically state torture. It says right in the code. But anywhere where it's not divided into state and non-state, women can take the pornography to their state or to their country and say that we're enduring torture, and or that women as a people are enduring torture and we want it to stop. I wish there was a law against non-state torture in Canada. That would be one way we could really do that.
And it's interesting how women have not thought to use the law when torture was available. Like, I remember one woman from California, she was telling us that she felt she was tortured when she was in prostituted victimizations. And we said, well, there's a law in California. And she said, I didn't know that. You know, it's because we've been so conditioned, so socially around the world, to think that women didn't endure torture. It was always assault or something else, you know. And so that kind of victimization, we've not internalized the right that we have not to be subjected to torture, regardless of who's doing it. They can call it whatever they want, but if it's torture, it's torture. And like she said, I never thought about it. She said, I never thought that I should use the law in California around my victimization. So it's social education. Women have to get this on the continuum of the form of violence that they suffer.
I see 2 questions there. Anyone's welcome to get in touch with us about any questions they have. There's one there about a director around a proposal, and the other one is about international models of community and educational engagement. Do you want to talk about the model of self that you developed?
Yeah, I can talk about the internalized model of self. Really, I used it as a public health nurse. I developed it to teach children, 10-year-olds actually, about their relationship with themselves. And in doing that, they were at that puberty stage. So it was about puberty, it was development, it was about pregnancy, and it was about violence. And the model was called a relationship model, and I take exception to the education that children are often subjected to when they call it sex education. I do not believe we should call it sex education. I think we should call it relationship. What kind of relationship do you have with yourself? What kind of relationship do you have with others? So that was the framework that I used. And of the children that I had about 1,000 evaluations before the Department of Health that I was working in wanted to stop working with children in the school. But of the 1,000 evaluations, about 90% said the most important thing they learned was they had a relationship with themselves, that they had no idea that they had a relationship with themselves. And how that was built is coming to understand that they had emotional feelings, they had physical feelings, they had their own thoughts, their own belief system, that all that had to be clarified. And we use the same model for the women who have been tortured, you know, because they have no sense that if they have no sense they're a person, if they harm, if their survival has gone that deep that they do not know they're human, they have to learn to rebuild that relationship with themselves piece by piece. And it's hard to explain the model that I have. It's in the book, but it's coming to understand that they have emotions. Emotions have feelings, physical feelings. And I used to tell the kids, this was one example that was effective. I used to say to them, well, just imagine you were walking across the stage and you stubbed your toe, and then you fell flat on the stage in front of 1,000 people. So what would you feel? Well, they'd know embarrassment. They'd feel really embarrassed, and they'd have a sore toe. So then I'd say, okay, just remember that 5 years went by, and then you started talking about that. Would your toe still hurt, or would the embarrassment still come back? So most of them knew the embarrassment would come back. So they understood in their relationship with themselves that emotions are very strong. So in order to heal, in that model is to heal the emotion. The emotion sticks like crazy glue. So for the women we work with, they have to learn that self-hatred is an emotion. It sticks like crazy glue. So you have to argue why that shouldn't stick like crazy glue. You know, you have a relationship with yourself. That self-hatred was put there by somebody else. So this is the model that we use that helps them to understand.
And boys, too, she's
boys.
talking about, because if boys learn early, when they're 10, or even be better younger, but at 10, that they have a relationship with themselves, and how they treat others affects their relationship with themselves and the feelings they have. You know, they're not going to want to look at pornography and all of those other very violent medians. So it's a way for boys and girls to learn about equality and the support of one another instead of domination in a classroom. And it works really well. And like Jeanne said, it is in our model and in our book. So
yeah, and the human right. Often we take the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We use that with the women who are healing, and we have a model on the patriarchy to help them understand the domination and the subordination, the domination, male domination, and subordination of women, and how that filters in our culture, how it filters through the policies and practices and structures, and how that filters right down into relationships. And that model has to be shifted to equality. Mm-hmm. And when we showed them in a very simple way how that works, often they would take the Universal Declaration and they'd hug it to themselves and say, you know, that's really what I'm permitted to have, you know. And this worked for the kids, and it works for the women too, to know that it wasn't just Linda and I saying to you, you're a human being, you have human rights, you've had them. The Universal Declaration was 1946. You've had them for all these decades. So it's not just Linda and I telling you this, but the world has told you this, and that's important. That's important for women to know that it might be some perpetrators here, but the whole world is up here, and they're saying these perpetrators are wrong. So it's like evidence. It's a way to try to give evidence that's bigger than just my voice or your voice. It's a global voice, and we have found that very powerful too.
We're probably taking up more time than we should now.
No, it's okay. There's no more questions, so I think we can finish for now. But I wanted to thank you on behalf of Radical Girls for being one of those women that don't shut up, so to say, as you wrote in your email. And thank you so much for agreeing to do this. I'm really glad this was the end.
We thank you so much, Radical Girls, because you've been so supportive. It's very, very moving to be welcomed and heard.
And I hope you've got a safe place to live.
We do. I do now.
Okay.
Tomorrow on the Radical Girls page, I will publish the resources that you women sent to me. Okay. That way they're not just, I want other women, all the women that come to our Facebook page to have access to them. So with your authorization, I'll do just that.
Great.
We can set the podcast. Yeah, we're getting a lot of positive around the podcast.
Yeah.
Is it the one you did with Celia?
No, it's another one. It's one we did with a university professor here in Nova Scotia.
On feminism. Yeah.
You got a message here. Thank you, my granddaughters, and all granddaughters, thank you, and my grandsons too.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I will send you the recording as soon as it's done.
Okay.